My parents threatened to curse my children if I didn't marry a stranger of their choosing, so I staged fake omens to trick them into changing their minds. My parents are threatening to curse my future children with eternal misfortune if I don't marry the person they have chosen for me. This is going to sound insane, I know. I'm Jet, 28 years old, and I'm currently staring down the barrel of a situation so ridiculous it feels like it's ripped straight from a telenovela, except it's my actual life and it's not funny. My parents, bless their hearts, are deeply traditional. We're talking old school, like they still refer to the internet as the Google machine, and believe that a firm handshake can solve most of life's problems. Except, in this case, their traditionalism has taken a turn for the aggressively bizarre. For generations, my family has practiced a certain kind of folk religion, a blend of old country beliefs passed down through our lineage. It's always been there, a background hum to our lives, mostly harmless things like blessings for good harvests and rituals for warding off bad luck. I participated as a kid, mostly because it was just what we did, like celebrating holidays or going to church on Sundays. As I got older, I drifted away from it, seeing it more as cultural tradition than actual spiritual practice. My parents, however, have only become more devout. Recently, they've become fixated on my marital prospects. I've been dating Paige for 2 years. She's amazing. She's smart, funny, kind, and we just fit. We've talked about the future, about maybe eventually settling down together, but we're both in our late 20s and taking things at a comfortable pace. My parents apparently do not approve of this comfortable pace. They've always been polite to Paige, if a little reserved. I chalked it up to them being slow to warm up to new people. Turns out it wasn't reservation, it was simmering disapproval. A few weeks ago, they invited me over for dinner, standard Sunday night family meal. Except this time, after dinner, my father cleared his throat and my mother produced a photo album. Not a family photo album, mind you. This was a dedicated album filled with pictures of Carlos. Carlos, as I was informed, is the son of a distant family friend, someone my parents haven't seen in years but apparently keep in touch with through yearly holiday cards and the occasional stilted phone call. Carlos, based on these photos, is a perfectly pleasant-looking man. He's smiling in most of the pictures, posing with various trophies and diplomas. He looks fine, perfectly average, which I guess is the problem. He's not Paige. My parents proceeded to explain with an unnerving level of earnestness that they had been guided to Carlos. Guided by whom, you ask? Well, by the ancestors, naturally. Apparently, during some elaborate ritual involving candles, herbs, and chanting that I thankfully was not privy to, they received a sign that Carlos was my destined partner. Not just any partner, mind you, but the partner ordained by fate itself to ensure the continued prosperity and well-being of our family line. I laughed. I admit it, it was a nervous, incredulous laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. My parents did not find it amusing. My father's face hardened and my mother's eyes, usually so warm, turned cold. They explained in increasingly dramatic terms that this was not a suggestion, it was a directive. Marrying Carlos was not just a good idea, it was a spiritual imperative. They went on and on about lineage, destiny, and the importance of following the paths laid out for us by those who came before. Then came the threat, and this is where it gets truly bonkers. If I refused to marry Carlos, if I dared to defy the will of the ancestors, they would curse my future children. Not just with a little bad luck, mind you. They talked about eternal misfortune, about shadows clinging to their souls, about generations suffering for my disobedience. They painted a picture of my hypothetical offspring living lives of unending misery, all because I wouldn't marry a man I've never met based on a sign from a candlelit ritual. I was stunned, speechless. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at them, trying to process the sheer audacity of what they were saying. They were serious, deadly serious. They genuinely believed they had the power to curse my unborn children, and they were willing to use that power to force me into a marriage I didn't want. I left that dinner feeling like I'd stepped into some kind of alternate reality. I told Paige about it, expecting her to laugh it off with me. She didn't laugh, she looked genuinely concerned. Paige, while not religious herself, is very respectful of other people's beliefs. She's worried, not about the curse exactly, but about the pressure this is going to put on me on us. I'm torn. Part of me wants to completely dismiss this as utter nonsense. It's 2024. Curses, really. But another part of me, a deeply ingrained part of me that grew up with these beliefs, is uneasy. What if they actually believe they can do this? What if, even if it's just psychological, this threat hangs over my future family? And how do I even begin to navigate this? Do I just ignore them? Do I try to reason with them? Do I introduce them to Carlos and see if we spontaneously combust from lack of chemistry? I'm posting this here because I genuinely don't know what to do. Has anyone else ever dealt with anything remotely like this? Am I overreacting? Am I underreacting? Help me, Reddit, I'm officially losing my mind. Update 1*, okay, wow. I did not expect this many responses. Thank you to everyone who commented, offered advice, or just commiserated. Reading through your replies has actually made me feel a little less insane, or at least less alone in my insanity. A lot of people suggested I should just cut my parents off. Honestly, that's a thought that's crossed my mind more than once in the last few days, but it's not that simple. Despite this whole curse marriage Carlos craziness, my parents aren't bad people. They're just intensely misguided and maybe a little bit power trippy when it comes to their beliefs. Cutting them off completely feels like a nuclear option, and I'm not sure I'm ready to detonate that bomb just yet. Plus, there's the guilt factor. They are my parents, and despite this, I do love them. Several commenters suggested I should call their bluff, to challenge them on this curse. To basically say, okay, curse away, let's see what happens. This is tempting, I admit. Part of me wants to be defiant to prove to them that I'm not going to be bullied into marrying someone I don't want to marry. But then that little voice in the back of my head whispers, what if they're serious? What if it actually works? Irrational, I know, but that ingrained fear is hard to shake. I did take the advice of a few people who suggested I try to talk to them again, but this time with a different approach. Instead of arguing or dismissing their beliefs, I tried to understand where they were coming from. I went over to their house last night, armed with a box of their favorite pastries. Bribery is sometimes the only language they understand. I started by acknowledging their beliefs, telling them I respected their traditions and understood that these things were important to them. I even said I appreciated their concern for my future and the well-being of our family line. This seemed to soften them a little. Then I gently steered the conversation towards Carlos. I asked them to tell me more about him. What exactly made him so destined for me? Their answers were vague. They talked about his good character, his strong family values, his successful career, all perfectly fine qualities, but nothing that screamed soulmate or divine intervention. When I pressed them on the sign they received, they became even more evasive. They mumbled something about feelings and intuition and the ancestors guiding their hearts. It was clear they didn't have a concrete reason, just a strong, unwavering conviction. I then tried to explain my perspective. I told them about Paige, about how happy I am with her, about the future we're building together. I emphasized that I valued their opinions and wanted their blessing, but ultimately this was my life, my decision. And I couldn't marry someone just because they thought it was destined, especially when I was already in a loving relationship with someone else. This did not go well. My father sighed heavily and said I was being stubborn and blinded by worldly desires. My mother started to cry, saying I was breaking her heart and disrespecting our ancestors. They reiterated the curse, this time with even more dramatic flair, adding details about illness, poverty, and general misfortune plaguing my future children if I disobeyed. The conversation ended with me feeling even more frustrated and confused than before. They are completely unmovable. They genuinely believe they are doing what's best for me, even if it means threatening to curse my hypothetical future family. It's like talking to a brick wall that can potentially unleash supernatural misery on my unborn kids. Paige has been incredibly supportive through all of this. She's been researching folk religions and curses online, trying to find any information that might be helpful. She even found a website that sells curse-breaking kits. We laughed about that, but there's a nervous edge to our laughter. One commenter suggested I should meet Carlos, just to see what he's like. To at least say I gave it a chance. Honestly, the thought of it makes me cringe, but maybe it's worth considering. Maybe if I meet him and he's clearly not a match, my parents will finally see reason. Or maybe it'll just make things even weirder. I'm leaning towards weird, very, very weird. I'm going to sleep on it. Maybe tomorrow I'll have a brilliant curse-proof plan. Or maybe I'll just book a one-way ticket to a remote island and change my name. Stay tuned, Reddit. This saga continues. Update 2. Okay, so I met Carlos, against my better judgment and mostly because Paige convinced me it was worth a shot. I contacted my parents and asked them to arrange a meeting. They were ecstatic, like genuinely thrilled. It was like I'd just announced I was converting to their religion and joining a monastery all in one go. The meeting was awkward, incredibly, excruciatingly awkward. My parents set it up as a lunch at a fancy restaurant, the kind of place where the waiters wear white gloves and you need a reservation weeks in advance. Carlos arrived promptly, dressed in a suit and tie, looking like he'd just stepped out of a corporate brochure. He was polite, well-mannered, and utterly bland. We made small talk for about an hour. He talked about his job in finance, his hobbies, golf and stamp collecting apparently, and his admiration for my parents. Tried to steer the conversation towards anything remotely interesting, but it was like pulling teeth. He was nice, don't get me wrong, but there was zero spark, zero chemistry, zero anything. It was like talking to a very polite, very well-dressed robot. My parents, however, were beaming. They hung on his every word, nodding approvingly at his pronouncements on the stock market and his meticulously detailed description of his stamp collection. They kept shooting me meaningful glances like, see. Isn't he perfect? I just smiled weakly and tried to survive the lunch without spontaneously combusting from boredom. After lunch, my parents cornered me, practically vibrating with excitement. Well, my mother asked, her eyes shining, What do you think? Isn't he wonderful? I tried to be diplomatic. He's nice, I said, carefully choosing my words. He seems like a very nice man. Nice, my father scoffed. He's more than nice, Jet. He's suitable. He's the one the ancestors have chosen for you, I sighed. Mom, Dad, I appreciate you arranging this, but honestly, I just don't see it. There's no connection, no anything. My mother's face fell. But the sign, the ancestors. Maybe the ancestors were wrong, I said, immediately regretting it as my father's face turned purple. Don't you dare blaspheme, he roared. You think you know better than our ancestors, than fate itself. We launched into another argument, almost identical to the previous ones. Curses, destiny, disobedience, eternal misfortune. It was like Groundhog Day, but instead of Bill Murray, I was trapped in a loop of parental guilt-tripping and supernatural threats. Carlos, bless his bland heart, seemed completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. He just stood there, smiling politely, occasionally nodding as if he was following the conversation. I honestly felt a little sorry for him. He was clearly just as much a pawn in this bizarre game as I was. Later that evening, Paige and I debriefed over pizza and copious amounts of wine. We both agreed that meeting Carlos had been enlightening, not in a good way. It had solidified my resolve not to marry him no matter what my parents threatened, but it had also made me realize just how deeply entrenched they were in this delusion. Reasoning with them was clearly not going to work. Paige, ever the pragmatist, suggested a different approach. Maybe, she said, thoughtfully chewing on a pepperoni slice, maybe we need to fight fire with fire. I raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we learn curse-breaking rituals, she grinned. Not exactly, but maybe we can use their own beliefs against them. If they think the ancestors want me to marry Carlos, maybe we can convince them the ancestors have changed their minds. This was intriguing and completely insane, but at this point, insane seemed like the only logical option. We started brainstorming, throwing around ideas, fueled by pizza and wine and a healthy dose of desperation. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to out-crazy my crazy parents. Operation Ancestor Anarchy is officially underway. Wish us luck, we're going to need it. Resolution Operation Ancestor Anarchy, as Paige dramatically dubbed it, was a wild ride, and surprisingly it actually worked, sort of. Our plan was to stage our own spiritual intervention, to create a counter-narrative that would convince my parents that the ancestors had, in fact, changed their minds and no longer wanted me to marry Carlos. We knew we had to be subtle, believable, and just crazy enough to appeal to their particular brand of folk religion. Paige, bless her theatrical soul, took the lead. She spent hours researching our family's specific traditions, poring over old family journals, and even discreetly questioning my grandmother, who, thankfully, is a lot more grounded than my parents. She discovered a particular ritual involving dreams and omens that was considered especially significant in our lineage. We decided to stage a series of dream omens that would suggest the ancestors were displeased with the Carlos plan. We started small with vague pronouncements of unsettling dreams and bad feelings. I'd casually mention these to my parents during our weekly phone calls, acting slightly worried but mostly just confused. They initially dismissed it as stress, but Paige kept subtly escalating things. Then came the omens. We started with minor things, like accidentally breaking a family heirloom, a cheap ceramic vase we bought at a thrift store and aged with dirt, and finding a dead bird on their doorstep courtesy of a very realistic-looking rubber bird Paige found online. Each omen was carefully orchestrated to be just ambiguous enough to be interpreted as a sign of ancestral displeasure, but not so obvious that it would seem staged. My parents started to get worried. They're superstitious, remember. These omens were playing directly into their deepest fears. They started questioning their own sign about Carlos, wondering if they had misinterpreted something. Paige and I subtly fanned the flames of doubt, suggesting that maybe the ancestors were testing them, or perhaps they had angered the spirits in some way. The turning point came with the dream. Paige, using her newfound knowledge of our family's dream symbolism, concocted an elaborate dream scenario involving shadowy figures, wilting flowers, and a general sense of impending doom. I recounted this dream to my parents with as much dramatic flair as I could muster, emphasizing the feelings of dread and unease it had instilled in me. This, apparently, was the final straw. My parents were convinced. The ancestors were displeased. The Carlos plan was doomed. They called me sounding genuinely distraught and confessed that they had been wrong about Carlos. The ancestors, they now believed, were actually warning them against this union. They apologized for pressuring me, for threatening me, for everything. I was stunned. It had actually worked. Our ridiculous, elaborate, completely insane plan had somehow convinced my equally ridiculous, elaborate, completely insane parents to back down. The cursed threat, thankfully, vanished with the Carlos plan. They haven't mentioned it since. They've even started being nicer to Paige. Not exactly welcoming her with open arms, but definitely less reserved, more accepting its progress, baby steps. As for Carlos, he's completely out of the picture. My parents haven't mentioned him again, and I haven't heard from him. I imagine he's back to his stamp collection and golf course, blissfully unaware of the bizarre spiritual drama he was briefly entangled in. Paige and I are still together, stronger than ever and slightly traumatized by the whole experience. We've learned a valuable lesson: never underestimate the power of reverse psychology, especially when dealing with deeply ingrained beliefs. And maybe, just maybe, there's a tiny part of me that believes the ancestors actually did intervene. Or maybe it was just a really elaborate, very lucky coincidence. Either way, I'm not questioning it. I'm just grateful it's over. For now. Because with my parents, you never know what kind of divine guidance they'll receive next. Fingers crossed it doesn't involve arranged marriages or curses. Or maybe, just maybe, we've finally earned a little peace.
My husband bought a sovereign citizen starter kit and now refuses to pay taxes or acknowledge the government, threatening our home and savings after embracing dangerous ideologies. What should I do? It started subtly, like most things that unravel your life. James always had a streak of libertarianism, a healthy skepticism of authority, I thought. He'd grumble about taxes, government overreach, the usual stuff you hear on talk radio. I usually tuned it out honestly. We have a good life. We're comfortable, not rich, but comfortable. We own our home, we have our health, we have each other, or so I thought. It was last week when I was cleaning out the garage, something I do maybe twice a year, a deep dive into the accumulated junk. Behind a stack of old tires, I found a box. A plain brown cardboard box taped shut. Curiosity got the better of me, so I dragged it out into the light and opened it. Inside was a kit, that's the only word for it. A sovereign citizen starter kit, the label proclaimed in bold, slightly amateurish lettering. My stomach dropped. I pulled out the contents. Thick binder filled with legal-sounding jargon and handwritten notes, a USB drive, a stack of pre-printed forms with titles like Notice of Non-Consent and Declaration of Independence from Government Overreach. There was even a little laminated card that looked like a driver's license, but instead of state of our state, it said private citizen, free inhabitant. My blood ran cold. I knew vaguely what sovereign citizen meant. I'd seen news stories, heard snippets on podcasts, people who believed they were outside the jurisdiction of the government, who refused to pay taxes, who sometimes got into trouble with the law. People who were, frankly, a little unhinged. I felt sick. James, my James, the man who meticulously filed our taxes every year, who always obeyed traffic laws, who complained about jury duty but always showed up. It couldn't be. I went inside, box in hand, heart hammering against my ribs. James was in the living room, scrolling on his phone. James, I said, my voice trembling slightly, what is this? I held out the box. He glanced at it, then back at his phone. Oh, that, yeah. He didn't seem surprised or ashamed or anything, just nonchalant. Yeah, what, James? This is a sovereign citizen starter kit. Are you serious? He finally looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Jessica, don't make a big deal out of it. I was just looking into some things. Looking into things. James, this is about declaring yourself outside the law. This is about refusing to pay taxes. This is insane. My voice rose despite myself. He sighed, the put-upon sigh he usually reserved for when I asked him to unload the dishwasher. It's not insane, Jessica. It's about freedom. It's about taking back control. Don't you see what's happening? The government is controlling everything, taking our money, telling us what to do. James, that's just how society works. We pay taxes for roads, for schools, for firefighters. We have laws to keep us safe. Safe? They're not keeping us safe, Jessica. They're enslaving us. We're all just cogs in their machine. He was starting to sound like one of those online conspiracy theorists, the kind I usually rolled my eyes at. But this was James, my husband. James, please, this is dangerous. This isn't some harmless hobby. People get into serious trouble doing this. They get arrested. They lose everything. He waved his hand dismissively. That's just scare tactics, Jessica. They want you to be afraid, but I'm not afraid. I'm awake now. I see the truth. The truth? James, the truth is you bought a box of crazy from some website and now you think you're a law unto yourself. I was practically yelling now, tears welling in my eyes. I felt like I was talking to a stranger. He stood up, his face hardening. Don't you talk to me like that, Jessica. I'm trying to explain something important to you. Something that could change our lives for the better. Better? James, how could this possibly be better? We could lose our house, we could go to jail. We won't go to jail, Jessica. If we do this right, they can't touch us. We'll be free, truly free. He looked at me, his eyes shining with a fervor I didn't recognize. It was like he was possessed. James, I pleaded, my voice cracking, please just throw this away. Let's forget about this. Let's go back to normal. He shook his head, a sad, pitying look on his face. You just don't get it, Jessica. You're still asleep, but I'm awake now, and I can't go back to sleep. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, holding the box of my husband's descent into madness. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My normal life, the life I thought we had, was suddenly teetering on the edge of a cliff, and I had no idea how to pull it back. Update 1: the past few weeks have been a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. James has become completely consumed by this sovereign citizen nonsense. He spends hours online, watching videos, reading forums, and talking to, I don't even know who. He's become secretive, always whispering on the phone, closing his laptop when I come into the room. He started talking differently too. He uses phrases like natural person, straw man, common law, and other jargon that sounds like gibberish to me. He tries to explain it, but it's like he's speaking another language. Something about how we're all tricked into being legal fictions and that the government is a corporation and taxes are voluntary. It's all convoluted and frankly, terrifying. The most immediate and terrifying consequence is the taxes. He's declared he's not paying them anymore. Our property taxes are due next month and our income taxes are looming. I've tried to reason with him to explain the real-world implications. I showed him articles about people who have been jailed, who have had their assets seized, who have ruined their lives because of this ideology. He just dismisses it all as propaganda, as the system trying to keep people down. "Jessica, you're so naive," he said to me the other night, his voice laced with condescension. "You actually believe what they tell you. Don't you see it's all a scam? They're stealing our money, and for what? To fund their wars and their corruption? James, we use those taxes, we benefit from them, we drive on roads, we have police protection, we have Medicare." I was practically begging him to see sense. "Medicare? Jessica, you're healthy, we don't need Medicare. And police? They're just there to enforce their unjust laws." He was spiraling further and further into this alternate reality. The practical stakes are enormous. Our house is on the line, our savings are at risk, our future is uncertain. Emotionally, it's even worse. I feel like I'm losing him. The man I married, the man I loved, is being replaced by this zealot. He's become distant, cold, almost hostile. He looks at me like I'm the enemy, like I'm part of the system he's fighting against. I've talked to Angel, my best friend, about it. She's horrified. "Jessica, you need to get out of there," she said, her voice tight with worry. "This is serious. This isn't just some weird phase, this is dangerous." But he's my husband," I stammered, tears welling up again. "I love him, I don't want to leave him." "Love him? Jessica, he's not the man you married anymore. He's being brainwashed. You need to protect yourself, protect your future." Angel is always practical, always grounded. But this time, her practicality felt like a cold, hard slap in the face. I've also considered talking to his family, but I'm hesitant. His parents are elderly and frail, and I don't want to upset them. His brother Benjamin is, well, Benjamin is a bit of a conspiracy theorist himself, though thankfully not to this extreme. I'm afraid if I talk to Benjamin, he might actually encourage James, see it as some kind of validation of his own fringe beliefs. So I'm stuck. Trapped between my love for the man he was and the fear of the man he's becoming. Do I leave? Do I try to fight? Do I just stand by and watch our lives crumble around us? I honestly don't know what to do. Every day feels like walking on eggshells, waiting for the inevitable explosion. And I'm terrified of what that explosion will look like. Update 2 * things have escalated rapidly in the last few weeks. It's no longer just about taxes. James has started refusing to acknowledge any government authority, period. He took down our license plates, claiming they were adhesion contracts, and replaced them with homemade signs that say private conveyance, not for hire. He refuses to renew his driver's license, saying he's a free inhabitant and doesn't need one. He even tried to refuse to pay for gas at a gas station, arguing that he was a sovereign individual and therefore exempt from commercial transactions. That didn't go well. He ended up getting into a shouting match with the cashier, and I had to intervene and pay for the gas myself, mortified. The real crisis hit last week. We received a notice from the IRS, a very official-looking, very scary notice. It was about our unpaid taxes, of course. It outlined penalties, interest, and the potential for liens on our property. I panicked. I showed it to James, my hands shaking. "James, look at this. This is real. This is happening." He glanced at it, completely unfazed. "That's just their intimidation tactics, Jessica. It's all bluff and bluster. They can't do anything to us. We're outside their jurisdiction." "James, they can take our house. They can ruin us." I was on the verge of a complete meltdown. He actually laughed. "Let them try, Jessica. I've prepared for this. I've filed all the paperwork. They have no legal claim over us." He pulled out the binder from the kit, flipping through pages filled with nonsensical legal theories and pseudo-legal documents. He showed me something called a declaration of status, which he claimed he had filed with someone, I'm not even sure who. He seemed to genuinely believe that this piece of paper would magically shield us from the IRS. That's when I knew I had to take action. I couldn't reason with him anymore. He was too far gone, lost in his own delusional world. I called a lawyer. Angel had given me the name of a family law attorney she knew, someone who had dealt with similar situations. The lawyer, Ms. Evangeline Reed, was blunt and direct. "Mrs., my last name, Your husband is engaging in extremely risky and illegal behavior. He is jeopardizing your financial security and potentially your freedom. You need to protect yourself. She explained the legal realities of sovereign citizenship, the utter lack of legal basis for their claims, and the very real consequences they faced. She confirmed my worst fears: Levi's asset seizures, even jail time. She advised me to separate our finances immediately, to document everything, and to consider divorce. Divorce. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. I didn't want to divorce James. I still loved him, or at least, I loved the man he used to be. But I couldn't let him drag me down with him. I couldn't let him destroy our lives. I started taking steps. I opened a separate bank account, transferred half of our joint savings into it, and started consulting with a financial advisor to protect our assets as much as possible. It felt like preparing for war against my own husband. The tension in the house is unbearable. We barely speak. When we do, it's always about this. He tries to convert me, to wake me up. I try to reason with him to bring him back to reality, but it's like talking to a brick wall. He's completely convinced he's right, that everyone else is wrong, that he's some kind of enlightened rebel fighting against a corrupt system. Last night, we had our biggest fight yet. I told him I was consulting with a lawyer, that I was considering divorce. He exploded. He accused me of betraying him, of siding with the system, of not supporting his awakening. He said I was weak, afraid, brainwashed. He even called me names he'd never used before. "You're going to regret this, Jessica," he hissed, his face contorted with anger. "You're going to see. I'm doing this for us, for our freedom, and you're just too blind to see it." "Freedom?" I retorted, my voice trembling with rage and despair. "James, you're trading real freedom for a fantasy? You're throwing away our lives for a delusion?" He just glared at me, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fanaticism. It was then, looking into those eyes, that I truly understood. The man I loved was gone. He was lost, swallowed whole by this dangerous ideology, and I had to make a choice. Stay and drown with him, or save myself and maybe, just maybe, find a way to pull him back from the brink. But right now, saving myself feels like the only option left, and it breaks my heart.